Welcome back to chapter 16 on evolution. Let me just quickly go back and just kind of recap the end of our last little bit of notes. You don't need to know Darwin's detailed trip, but just a couple of highlights. Darwin was very observant about different parts of the world having similar species, and even though they were separated, they had organisms that had similar ecological roles and looked really similar. So really good example are the large flightless birds south of the equator. Darwin also noted that, and he did his most notable studies in the Galapagos Islands, that in that area there were finches on different islands that were best suited to the habitat that they were in. And just a little bit of background information, the Galapagos Islands, each island is not the same. There are some that are more desert-like, there are some that are more tropical, and the finches that are on those islands have different beaks that are either more insectivorous or more plant-eating type beaks. And Darwin was like, wow, there's all these different types of finches. How did all of these different finches get all the way out here in the middle of the Galapagos Islands, which is, by the way out in the Pacific Ocean? And so he started thinking that it's very possible that these different species of finch that we now have today were probably from a founder finch that came from South America that managed to get all the way out to the Galapagos Islands, colonized the islands, and then eventually evolved into the many varieties that are there today. So when Darwin came back, he began to write about his observations, notably named the process of evolution, which I will talk about in a little bit. He wrote a very famous book called On the Origin of Species that was published in 1859. And in it, he outlined a few fundamental principles that were involved with evolution. The first is artificial selection. And in that outline, he said, you know what, it's not so weird for me to talk about how organisms can change over time because humans have done it. Humans have chosen the breeders in certain organisms that we use either agriculturally or domestically, and we have chosen the breeders to have offspring that have desired traits. Great example is wild mustard has been bred either for the flowers or for the leaves or for different parts of it, the stems, and that means that broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, they're all related to the wild mustard plant, and they were all due to artificial selection. With dogs, all of the different breeds of dogs that you're familiar with are all descendants of the wolf, and it was due to artificial selection and man's intervention that we have all of these different breeds of dogs. The same can be said for cattle, pigeons, cats. So Darwin said, you know what? Artificial selection is when humans choose the breeders. Well, what if nature is choosing who's the breeders? And so that's going to be called natural selection, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Darwin also outlined the fact that all organisms struggle to survive. They must obtain food and water, have a space to live, avoid predators, and then eventually have babies of their own. And if an organism is better suited to its environment, if it's faster or more camouflaged, can avoid being caught, it is said to be more fit. And so what we call this is fitness. That's a T. So that said, knowing what fitness is, whenever you hear survival of the fittest, it means that the organisms that have these beneficial traits that enable them to survive and reproduce are called, these traits are called adaptations. And I'm sorry that this is a really small line. I did not mean for it to be. These heritable adaptations, or characteristics that are beneficial, increase your chances of survival. And if individuals that don't have these adaptations, more than likely they will die or leave fewer offspring. Individuals that have the adaptations that enable fitness survive and reproduce more successfully. And in theory, more and more members of the population will eventually have that adaptation as it gets passed down from parent to offspring if you survive and reproduce. So here is a little example. If, let's say, you have a population of insects and we spray this field with insecticide and they all get fogged, most of them are going to die. But the one member that has a gene that allows for survival will survive and reproduce. So you would consider that insecticide resistance gene to be an adaptation. And that adaptation increases this insect's fitness. And so when it survives, it will eventually reproduce, and more members of the population will have that adaptation, and the population has changed. It's gone from having a variety of different genes to most of them having that insecticide resistance gene. The population has evolved. So Darwin's theory of natural selection is often called survival of the fittest and vice versa. And it has 4 components. First of all, more individuals are produced or born in the environment than can survive. An oak tree produces thousands of acorns, but not every single one becomes a new oak tree. Salmon make many eggs, but not all of those eggs will survive to become little baby salmon. Most of them will die. In any population that is born, there is genetic variation. So all of those babies are variations of their parents. They are not identical. And that said, remember that traits are heritable from parent to offspring. With some members having traits more suited to the environment than others, so therefore they are more fit. The individuals that have increased fitness will survive and pass the beneficial traits on to future generations. So essentially the picture that I showed you up top is an example of survival of the fittest and natural selection. So in the end, all of these components of natural selection feed into evolution. And so evolution is the change in the relative frequency of a trait in a population over time due to natural selection. Now, another thing that Darwin outlined was that over time, over very long periods of time, you can have natural selection acting to drastically change the traits an organism can have, such that the modern version looks very different from the ancestor version. A great example is the modern elephant. So right now we only have 2 varieties of elephant left, the Asian and the African elephant. We do have fossils of their ancestors. I bet you've heard of the woolly mammoth before. Maybe you've heard of stegodon before. But the modern day elephants are derived from the ancestral versions a little bit less than 34 million years ago, which were much smaller than the modern elephant. But it's crazy to think that these guys over here were the ancestors to these very, very large land animals over here. But over time, their environment selected for this much longer nose, which now we call a trunk, that served as an adaptation for them to get food, keep themselves cool, sense their environment, etc. Another example, kind of going back to the Galapagos Islands, is the fact that there are multiple different varieties of tortoise on the islands, in the Galapagos Islands. And again, it probably was not all these different varieties colonized all the islands. It was probably just one ancestral tortoise that came over from the mainland of South America and over time evolved into the different species that are there today. So there is another example of descent with modification. And that is it for today.